Good morning. Today we are going to be changing out a Hydratube on a Pulsa 7120 Hydratube pump. So in order to do this, the first things we're going to need to do is we're going to have to set our stroke setting to 100% on the dial, and then we're going to shut the pump down and we are going to isolate it from power. With that done, the first step will be to remove your coupling guard and rotate the coupling manually until you can verify that the piston is in the fully rearward position. So I want to bring the top of the housing all the way forward, and we're set. Now we are ready to drain the head and remove it to replace the Hydratube. The next step is going to be to remove the bleeder valve using a 1/2-inch wrench. And then when you do this, you want to be sure that you do not lose the crush washer at the bottom of the bleeder valve. So check the bottom to make sure it's not on there. If not, it is most likely down in the hole for the bleeder. Next, we will remove the cap using a 5/16" Allen head wrench so that we can drain the intermediate head. The next step is going to be to drain the intermediate fluid out of the Hydratube head. On a typical pump on the bottom, you will have a plug which will screw into the bottom of the Hydratube head. In the case of our show pump, we've installed a valve for testing and for show purposes. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to open this valve and I'm going to drain out that fluid that's been in the Hydratube head. If you don't have a small little capture container, you're going to want to get one, possibly a bucket or a small pan or a drip tray, something to capture the fluid out of there. And you can see I've got a small 500 milliliter little bottle that I'm using for this purpose. Okay, so once that's all drained, I'll close my valve again, and we're ready for the next step of removing the head bolts and taking the Hydratube head off of the pump. With the intermediate head now drained, it's time to remove all of the head bolts so that we can remove our Hydratube head and change out that Hydratube. Please note that if your pump is still piped up to your system, these two lower bolts you will not be able to remove without removing your valving and connecting for the suction side. So I'm going to go ahead now and I'm going to remove all of these bolts. Be aware that you're going to get some oil dripping out of the hydraulic side of this pump as soon as you start to break this free. So it's very advisable that you've got a catch bucket underneath the head to catch that oil and minimize the spillage and cleanup afterwards. Okay, I've gotten almost all of the bolts off except for the last two, and you can see I'm starting to drain oil. So what I'm going to do is just try to tilt that forward a little bit so that I can get the oil to run out the bottom of the pump as best as I can. And then once that starts to tail off, I will remove the head and we will start to break down the Hydratube head. Okay, I've taken the bolts off and I've now removed my Hydratube head. And so you can see I've got my dish plate here on the pump head, and I've got my diaphragm on the Hydratube set. I'm going to take this off in a moment, and then we're going to start breaking down the Hydratube head so that we can change out that tube. While you've got this apart, you want to make sure that everything on the dish plate looks good, and you want to make sure that you have one of these 4 outer holes at 12 o'clock in alignment with the bleeder. Alrighty. Okay, so now that we've got the Hydratube head off and I've done some wiping down to get rid of the oil residue, I've pulled out the dish plate and I've wiped that down a little bit. I want to inspect the dish plate to see if it's cracked or if there's any damage to the dish plate that will hurt it from working. I can flip it around and I can hold it up to a light source and just verify that I have no plugged holes or anything that would be preventing oil to pass through the dish plate. My next task will be to remove the adapters so I can then take out the tube. Okay, I've removed my adapters from both ends of pump head, the Hydratube head. You can see I'm ready to get to that tube. So now I'm just going to start at one end, and I'm going to fold this in all the way around, and I'm going to push it into the head and force it in, and then I should be able to get a hold of it from the other end and pull that tube out. Okay, so I've got this coming out now. I've got my Hydratube so that I can pull that the rest of the way out of the pump. So I'm just going to work on it very gently until I can force it the rest of the way out, and then we'll be ready to clean this head up and prepared to receive the new Hydratube. Alright, so now I've taken the brand new Hydratube that I'm going to insert into the pump head, and I've folded up the end so that it's small, and I've tied it off with a rubber band wrapped around it fairly tight. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this and I'm going to insert it into this head, and I'm going to work it ever so slowly until I can work it through the entire head and out the other side so that I can get a hold of it. So I can't do that with one hand, so I'm going to do this and then I'll return. Okay, you can see I've pushed that through and it's sticking out the other side. I've pushed this nice and flush so that the sealing surface is into the grooves of the bottom of the head. And now I'm going to pull this rubber band off, and with luck that should open up so that I can open that up. Sorry. So that I can now open that up and I can insert that into the grooves all the way around the head. There we go. And now my Hydratube has been installed, and you can see it in there. And now I'm ready to put my adapters back on and tighten those down. I'll put my dish plate back in, and I'll mount this back onto the pump head. Okay, so I've put my adapters back on and screwed them down, and I've got my dish plate installed now. So my last step with the Hydratube head is to install a brand new diaphragm. And with that installed, I'm now ready to mount that onto my pump and prepare to prime this thing and get it running. Okay, I've put the Hydratube head back on the pump, and I've torqued all of the head bolts down as specified in the owner's manual. What we need to do now is reattach the valving and connections, and then we'll need to prime the hydraulics as well as the Hydratube, and then we will be ready to go. So your replacement is complete.